Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Sarah and I work with the Living Archives project where we are collecting stories of how COVID-19 impacted various communities in Mecklenburg County. Today is March 2nd, 2023, and this week there were 137 reported cases of COVID-19 in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, which actually shows a decrease of 16% over the last 2 weeks. Therefore, each subject is comfortable not wearing a mask. Melissa, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Melissa. I am about 6 feet tall. I like to consider myself fairly thin. I have curly hair. I am Black. I identify as Black.
That's awesome.
Okay.
And you have a great smile.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Melissa, tell me a little bit about yourself. How long have you lived in Charlotte or in Mecklenburg County?
So I just moved to Charlotte from Baltimore, Maryland about 6 months ago.
Wow.
So I'm very new to the area.
Very cool. So what brought you to Charlotte?
I was looking for a fresh start and in a more peaceful environment, and so Charlotte spoke to me.
Yeah. What about Charlotte spoke to you, out of curiosity?
I have visited Charlotte twice, and during my visit, it was important for me to find a new place where I felt welcomed and at home. And Charlotte, out of all the places I've been, is one of the very few places I felt like, oh, I could see myself living here.
Wow, that's so cool. Tell me a little bit about Maryland. Is it very different from Charlotte?
There are a lot of differences.
Okay.
There's a lot more going on to me in Maryland and than Charlotte, and there's good and bad for both of those. But yeah, Maryland, there was more people, and so like during the pandemic and stuff, there was just like the world kind of just like stopped up there. But
Yeah. So tell me a little bit, you kind of referred to it, tell me a little bit about what was your life like during the pandemic when it came, and what was that like for you?
For me, the pandemic was like a whirlwind. So I think, in 2020, I got diagnosed with cancer for the second time.
Oh my
And
goodness.
I want to try not
I'm
to
so
cry.
sorry.
And so the pandemic for me was like a roller coaster. And I wish people knew like what it was like to be severely immunocompromised like during that time period.
Yeah.
You keep it together. So at the start of the pandemic, I'm just like everyone else, like, everyone's fighting. We're going through this like major battle, like as a country, like just like as a planet, we're going through this. So we're all taking precautions, and then like cancer hit again. And so it's like I had to add on like added precautions. And then my life was on the line like twice as much. And so the pandemic was hard for me. And I'm crying because it was a hard time.
Yeah.
But if I'm honest, I also had maybe one of the best years of my life. Like,
Wow.
and I learned a lot from the pandemic, and I guess some of the like regulations we had to follow, and like meeting people and like getting in touch with the people that, I had to share the house with like during the pandemic. So it was interesting.
Yeah. So I'm so sorry to hear about all that you've been through. As someone who was severely immunocompromised, tell me about that experience, because not a lot of people get to hear this side of how people like yourself who were immunocompromised were impacted by COVID and the restrictions and just the virus itself. So share with me a little bit about what were you feeling at that time? What was going through your head, and what did that look like?
Yes, so because I went through chemo as a part of my treatment, for anyone who doesn't know, it causes you to be severely immunocompromised to the point where I couldn't get chemo some days.
Wow.
And I throw that out there because so COVID had already shut things down. So, typically when you're going through treatment and things like that, you get to have family and friends with you when you're going through your chemo appointments. If you're going through surgery and you're in the hospital for a few days, like your family can visit you. And when you are, like during the pandemic, everything shut down. So there was no support. You couldn't have your normal support during that time period. And so I remember at one point, I was staying with my family during chemo. And both of my parents had public-facing jobs, and they were my support system. But they both unfortunately got COVID, and it got really bad. And so we were all isolating in this house, and there was me who, like, I couldn't even get chemo. I was so severely immunocompromised. But at the time, that was like where I could be. Like, they were my support system.
Yeah.
And so we wore masks around the house. Everyone was like, we were walking on eggshells during the entire pandemic. And it's no way to live, but you know, we have to take a responsibility for ourselves, each other, just like when we're out and about. So it was just like an added layer, and I hope that answered the question.
Oh, it did. Yeah, definitely. So when you were getting your treatments, you couldn't take anyone with you?
That's correct.
Okay.
So the hospitals were filled with people like dealing with COVID.
Yeah.
They really needed help. They had like, people were short staffed because, you know, a lot of energy needed to be put into like the pandemic, totally understandably. And to preserve like the severely immunocompromised people, like you couldn't have visitors in the hospital.
Yeah.
No one can come with you into your appointments unless it was like you were near death and you needed like instructions, hospice care and things like that. So
yeah. Did that change at any point? Like, did the restrictions get lifted during your chemotherapy, or was it like that the whole time?
I think it was the whole time that it was like that. And I'm like an introvert, so like there were days where I was just like, I'm enjoying like being by myself. But I think the forced like loneliness of like not having that support system was tough. At least for me and my community of survivors.
Yes. When you were receiving treatment, were you placed in a room by yourself, or were you surrounded by others who were also receiving treatment?
So although we couldn't bring anyone, we were still all in one room just getting chemo with, and so that was also scary because you know typically chemo it's like it is not a fun thing to do, but it is like you're relaxing, there's no mask, you're like eating, but here it's like you're wearing a mask, like everything is like it's very strict.
Yeah.
And so that added to the stress, I think.
For sure. And then after you would receive treatment, you mentioned you lived in a home. Did you live with others, or were you by yourself?
Yes, so I lived with my immediate family during yes.
Okay. And then you also mentioned your parents had COVID or at some point during your treatment. And so what was that like for you?
It was scary for so many reasons. They both of them had COVID. My mother was way more severe than my father. And they were diagnosed at the time where it wasn't, people were still having high symptoms and the death rate was pretty high. Yeah. So it was scary and we didn't know what we could do. And I think the worst part about it was like I would be like making her food and I would have to leave it at the bottom of the stairs, and then we would close the door and then she would have to come down and get it so that there were no like possible, but it was an incredibly scary time, I think, for all of us. But they're better now, so that is good.
Glad to hear. I'm so glad to hear that they're better now and that you're better now.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about how your life I feel like you went through so much these last few years with cancer and treatment, and then I'm assuming you are in remission?
Yes.
Amazing.
Thank you.
So happy for you. And then your move to a whole new state, to a whole new city, to a whole new job.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that transition. How was that like, and what kind of led you to make that decision?
So I did, so the pandemic helped me, along with my second diagnosis, helped me put life into perspective. And so I had reduced my hours to part-time. I'm a librarian, so that I could focus more on my health during treatment. And then once I was able to make it through treatment that year, which was 2021, like halfway through, I just decided to like take a big leap at the end of 2021 when I was done, and I traveled the US for a few months, and this is like after I sold my house to get the money for it.
Yeah.
And then I traveled, and then I went to Europe for a little bit. I did like Argentina, and during those travels, I realized how big the world was. And so Charlotte was one of the stops on my US portion of the trip. Okay. And I just decided I would never like waste any more time. And I had experienced so much in Maryland already that it was time to like bring my talents to Charlotte and experience it.
What a beautiful perspective, Melissa.
Thank you
for sharing. So you did a lot of traveling still during the height of COVID.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that, because I haven't really, a lot of people's experience was more, hey, stay safe, stay in one location. And not that you weren't staying safe, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's amazing that you decided to travel the US and to go abroad. What was that experience like?
It was like the best experience of my life. And COVID happening during this time did make me rethink doing the trip. I think it's a weird position because it's like when cancer is involved, you realize like life is short and you have to take advantage of things. And so I weighed my options, and it was really interesting to see the COVID protocols in like each state, as well as like the difference between what was happening in the US versus Europe.
Okay.
Just like how they handle vaccinations, the things that you can do when you're vaccinated here in the US versus like what you got to do when you were in Europe. The debates about like whether or not to get vaccinated. It was like living in like two completely different worlds. And even just from going from state to state, it's like some people still had like severe protocols in place. And then some people, it was like COVID had never happened. And so it was interesting.
Yeah. Would you be able to share a little more specifics? Like what stood out to you?
I think for me, the protocol surrounding vaccination was what surprised me the most. Paris was one of the places I went to, and you could do virtually nothing. You could barely go into a restaurant and sit down if you weren't vaccinated. They had electronic vaccination passes that you had to get. Doesn't matter where you're from. You could show your paper card, but sometimes you needed that electronic card. Also, the amount of doses. It feels like in the US here, once you got your full dose of the vaccination, that was considered vaccinated. But when I was in Europe, it was like, it wasn't considered full vaccination anymore. If you just had the 2 doses of Pfizer, you needed like the booster dose. And so it was just like a heightened security. And because I was like fresh off of treatment, I appreciated that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Was it difficult to get that electronic vaccination card when you were in Europe?
No, it was,
Okay.
I thought it was expensive. It was like $50, well, 50 euros, but I thought that was expensive. But as long as I had that paper card, I had just made the cutoff of when they were getting ready to start the point of you needing to have a booster to do most things there.
Okay, very interesting. Before we started the interview, we did this activity together called a hand map. Is there anything from your hand map that you would like to share with us?
I think maybe I would like to share, should I hold it up?
Okay. Whatever you want.
My beautiful drawing here.
Yes, it's lovely.
I guess as one of the things that when I think about COVID, for me is like a pause in time. And I tell people this all the time when they ask me about my experience throughout COVID. And for me, I call it my missing few years, because like life stopped. Like when all libraries here and also where I was working at the time. What we did, we weren't really interacting with the public like that. Like things weren't happening per normal. So it's like, it is like, there was so much happening during COVID for me that I barely remember it.
Yeah.
It was a pause in time, except for when I was traveling and like really enjoying things. And even then, I had crunched like so much into one time period that it was still like blur. And also, I just wanted to give a shout out to Lana Del Rey because Lana Del Rey, I listened to her music every morning when I was going through radiation towards the tail end of COVID, and I feel like a lot of people found some solace in music, and because like you couldn't really go out to like a concert or like a club where you might normally go, but you got to listen to music in your room, and I found so much like peace and like understanding in her music. So shout out to Lana Del Rey.
Cool. Thanks for sharing, Melissa.
Sure.
When you were getting treatment at that time, were you able to connect with others who were going through treatment, and did you feel supported at that time, or did you feel like that wasn't the case?
I felt supported in my family, and this is something that I was just talking about at this cancer survivorship conference.
Yeah.
That it was for me very difficult to find people who identified with what I was going through like during COVID. I have been to like in-person support groups and they just completely shut down, especially because we are immunocompromised, and so like it was just not worth the risk. So it was hard for me to find a support system. Luckily, technology, they were able to move some of the groups to like Zoom.
Okay.
And so we got to share some stories that way. And then Facebook groups have been a godsend. So I was able to like, and there are like thousands of women going through the same thing, and we post about what we're going through and get advice that way. Something that I might, chit chat with somebody at chemo about like, what do you do about this? But at the time, since I couldn't do that, so technology like saved me.
Wow. Do you feel like there was anything, I feel like you mentioned you gained perspective and you really gained a new outlook on life. Do you feel like there's anything else that you gained over the last few years?
This may fall into that category, but how important it is to be fearless, especially like with COVID. I think it was so unexpected.
Yeah.
And a lot of people died that like unexpectedly that maybe otherwise you would have thought would have lived for a long time. And so for me, I'm like, you have to live every day as if it's your last and take as many leaps as you can. Yes, because you never know when your last day could be. So you have to be as fearless in everything that you do. Don't worry about it. Do what you have to do.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Thank you. So tell me a little bit about what does life look like now? Now that a lot of restrictions have been lifted and we are in this, what people like to say, new normal. What does that look like for you?
For me, it's working full time again, having my own place. Now that I'm done with treatment, which has been amazing for me. For me, I do feel like a sense of like, I guess what is my spirit is like wanting to like get out more and things like that, which for me is, there's a sense of restlessness of like, this is like 9 to 5 life, and I love being a librarian and working with teens especially, but there's always like this little bit of like freedom that you feel like you're missing out on. So
yeah. How has it been working as a librarian? How has it been working with teens? Have any of the teens that you work with shared a little bit about their experiences over the last few years?
The only experiences specific, I guess, to like COVID would be like, I'll be talking to the teens, and some of the ones, they talk about how like their first few years were like COVID years in high school. And so there's like virtual learning and things like that. And I'm like saddened by that because there's a lot of experience that happens in school. Like there are dances, there's like, making social connections while you're at lunch and things like that. And I feel like some of them were like robbed of that. Like people were robbed of like graduation and prom. And so, but I say that as someone who has experienced those things, but to them, that is what like high school looks like for a year or two. And so it may be like a part of their norm a little bit. And so it has been interesting to hear some of those stories.
Yeah. Is there any story that stands out to you that you want to share?
Not that I can think of like specific.
That's okay. Do you find that as a librarian, when you work with people, specifically teens, but you'll probably also work with others, did you find that once restrictions were lifted that people were a little slower to come back to programming or just usage of the library, or do you find like people were ready?
I think it was a mix. I will say, the library I was working at during like when things kind of transitioned back from lockdown to like in person, we had nowhere near as many patrons post like lockdown, and it was always like a question of, do they not know that like we're back open, or are people like feeling unsafe coming into the library? There are always people who are like ready, like we loved the programs before, but then there's things to consider like mask policies and things like that, and how do we navigate like this new normal? So I think it's like a good mix, but I think even now in 2023, I think we're still figuring out like how to build things back up.
Mm-hmm. And then for you, because you kind of transitioned during different phases of COVID and the pandemic and restrictions, is there anything that stood out to you, either similarities or differences between the two libraries that you worked at during the last 2 years?
I don't know. Maybe not that I want to share, no.
That's okay. That's very fair. So I guess, in terms of with your new outlook in life, with really taking it every day at a time and living this fearless life that you mentioned, what does your future look like? What do you envision your future?
My future is like a creatively free life. I have like dedicated my entire career to working with my community, and I love every second of like empowering youth. I believe that it was like my calling, and so life for me looks like being able to do that and still like fulfill my want to like see the world, because the world is so big. And so whether it be like, I don't know how to do that yet because those are two like separate things, but like life for me looks like just exploring as much as possible.
I love that. When you get to explore and you get to travel and experience new communities and new places, what kind of sticks out to you, or what feelings do you have?
Words cannot describe. I feel like a sense of it's awesome. Like I like to learn new things. Like as a librarian, I'm always researching, and I just feel like I embrace uniqueness. And so when I'm traveling, it's like these little mini epiphanies where it's like, that's how they do things over here? Is this how they're living in Denver? Tokyo's like this. And so it's like a wow moment the entire time I'm on vacation. Like, wow. And like meeting people, and I just feel like things are so different, even though like we're all human, we're all living on the planet. Morals sometimes are the same. It's just like the way we do things can be really, very different.
Yeah. So just to follow up with one last question, is there any specific stories or experiences over the last few years, either in your season of receiving treatment for cancer, or as a librarian, or just as a traveler, learning new things. Do you have stories or experiences that just really stuck out to you that you would like to share with us? And it can be more than one.
I really want to share. I guess not.
Okay, that's okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you so much, Melissa. I appreciate your story. And thank you for your strength and resilience and endurance. And I'm so, so happy with the fact that you are in remission. And I'm so grateful for just this opportunity to hear your story. It's so valuable.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.